Man notices shocking detail on teenage boy's bag at airport, realizes something is wrong. Mark Lawson drummed his fingers against his leather briefcase, watching travelers stream past him in endless waves. After 15 years of corporate life, he still hadn't gotten used to the mundane reality of airport terminals. Perhaps it was the lingering instincts from his intelligence days, always scanning faces, always looking for patterns in the chaos. The Houston International Airport buzzed with its usual morning energy. A child wailed somewhere in the distance, demanding a chocolate bar. An elderly couple argued over their gate number. A group of college students, still half asleep, shuffled toward their budget airline counter. Normal. Ordinary. Exactly the kind of scene Mark had trained himself to analyze for anything that didn't quite fit. That's when he noticed the boy. Teenager, maybe 16 or 17, sitting alone near gate C4. Sandy brown hair, unremarkable clothes, a gray hoodie and worn jeans. But something about his posture caught Mark's attention. The way he hunched over his bag, one hand always maintaining contact with it, as if afraid it might disappear if he let go. Mark shifted in his seat, pretending to check his phone while keeping the boy in his peripheral vision. Years of fieldwork had taught him the art of watching without being watched. The teenager, who looked like he should be in high school rather than at an international terminal, kept glancing at his watch, then the departure board, then back to his bag. The bag itself wouldn't have warranted a second glance from most people. It was a standard backpack, the kind millions of students carried every day. But as the boy adjusted its position, Mark caught sight of something unusual. Intricate symbols stitched into the fabric with dark thread, forming patterns that seemed deliberately placed. Just another teenager with customized gear, Mark muttered to himself, trying to dismiss the uneasy feeling in his gut. Street fashion had evolved since his active duty days. Kids were always coming up with new trends, new ways to stand out. But those symbols. He'd seen something similar before, hadn't he? In a file marked classified during a briefing about covert communication methods. Mark pulled out his phone again, this time with purpose. He opened a secure browser, old habits die hard, and began searching through archived images of encryption patterns. His throat went dry when he found the match. These weren't random decorations. The symbols followed a specific sequence, a code developed by intelligence agencies for field operatives to communicate under duress. The pattern was supposed to have been retired years ago after being compromised in an operation in Eastern Europe. Mark stood up, gathering his belongings with deliberate slowness. He needed a closer look, but more importantly, he needed to know why a teenager was carrying a bag marked with classified intelligence symbols. "Mind if I sit here?" Mark asked, gesturing to the empty seat next to the boy. "The charging port at my spot isn't working." The teenager's head snapped up, eyes wide with something that looked too much like fear for Mark's comfort. I'd rather be alone," he mumbled, pulling the bag closer to his chest. "No problem," Mark said easily, but he caught the way the boy's hands trembled slightly. "Flying alone can be stressful. I remember my first solo flight, must have checked my passport 100 times." The boy said nothing, turning away to stare fixedly at the departure board. "I'm Mark, by the way." He tried again, keeping his tone casual. "Heading to Chicago for business." "You?" "I don't want to talk," the boy snapped, his voice cracking slightly. He stood up abruptly, slinging the bag over his shoulder with such force that one of the straps twisted. As he moved, Mark caught a clearer view of the symbols. There was no doubt now, these were definitely intelligence markers. But why would they be on a teenager's backpack? And why did the kid look like he was about to bolt at any second? The boy hurried away, weaving through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who didn't want to be followed. Mark watched him go, his mind racing through possibilities. None of them were good. He pulled out his phone again, this time opening an app that hadn't seen use in years. The decryption software was outdated, but it might still work. Mark pulled up the photo he'd managed to snap of the bag and began processing it, his heart rate picking up as he waited for the results. Around him, the airport continued its normal routine. Announcements echoed through the terminal. people rushed to their gates. A janitor methodically cleaned the windows. But Mark barely noticed any of it. His focus was entirely on the screen in front of him, watching as the old software worked to break down the pattern he photographed. When the message finally appeared, Mark felt his blood run cold. "Help me. They are watching." The words blinked up at him from the screen, transforming what had been mere suspicion into something far more dangerous. Mark looked up, scanning the terminal with new urgency. This time, he wasn't just people watching, he was looking for watchers. It didn't take long to spot the first one. A man in a perfectly pressed gray suit, standing near a coffee kiosk, his attention fixed on the direction the boy had gone. As Mark watched, the man made a subtle gesture toward the boarding gates. There, partially hidden behind a pillar, stood a second observer. Mark deleted the photo and pocketed his phone, his mind already shifting into operational mode. Whatever was happening here, it was clear the boy, whoever he was in serious trouble. The question was he a victim, or was he being used as bait in a game much bigger than himself? Either way, Mark knew he couldn't just walk away. Not with those symbols. Not with that message. Not with those men watching from the shadows. Somewhere in this crowded terminal, a teenager was carrying a bag with classified intelligence markings, being watched by unknown operatives, and silently begging for help. Mark checked his watch, then his own gate number. His flight to Chicago would be boarding soon, a normal business trip for his normal corporate job. But normal had just gone out the window. Mark stood up, straightened his tie, and began walking in the direction the boy had fled. Whatever was about to unfold, he had a feeling his business meeting would have to wait. Mark's hands moved swiftly across his phone screen as he followed the teenager through the terminal, keeping a careful distance. The decryption app, a relic from his agency days that he never quite brought himself to delete, hummed to life. The photo he'd taken of the bag's symbols was clearer now, revealing intricate details he'd missed at first glance. Each stitch formed part of a larger pattern, reminiscent of the encoding methods used in deep cover operations. But these weren't just random distress signals, they were expertly crafted, woven into the fabric with precision that spoke of professional training. As the app processed the complete image, more messages began appearing. "Help me! They are watching! Terminal C, Gate 47. Red Eagle Protocol." Mark's breath caught in his throat. Red Eagle Protocol, a term he hadn't heard in nearly a decade. It was an emergency extraction code, used only when an operative had been compromised and needed immediate evacuation. But why would these messages be stitched into a teenager's backpack? The boy Mark needed to know, his name, was now seated at a cafe near Gate 35, his shoulders tense as he pretended to read something on his phone. His fingers were trembling slightly as they gripped the device, and his eyes darted up every few seconds to scan his surroundings. Mark's attention shifted to the man in the gray suit he'd spotted earlier. The observer had moved positions, now leisurely reading a newspaper at a table with clear sight lines to both the cafe and the main corridor. His posture was too perfect, his attention too focused on something beyond the newspaper's pages. A subtle hand gesture from gray suit caught Mark's eye, 3 fingers tapping against the paper's edge, followed by a slight tilt of his head. Mark followed the signal's direction and spotted the second watcher, now positioned near a duty-free shop. This one was younger, dressed like a typical business traveler in a navy blazer, but his shoes gave him away, tactical boots poorly disguised as dress shoes, the kind favored by field agents for their grip and maneuverability. Mark's mind raced through scenarios. 2 watchers coordinating their movements. Professional training. A teenager with encoded distress signals. This wasn't a simple surveillance operation, it had all the hallmarks of an extraction. He opened his agency app again, this time accessing a different feature. Years ago, he'd helped develop a pattern recognition system that could identify operational signatures based on surveillance techniques. As he input the watcher's movements and positions, the results made his blood run cold. The pattern matched known methodologies of the Shadow Division, a controversial unit that specialized in acquiring assets with valuable intelligence, often using civilians as unwitting carriers. Their preferred method was to identify vulnerable targets, plant sensitive data on them, then extract both the target and the data once they'd crossed international borders. A new movement caught his eye. A third person had entered the scene, a woman in a flight attendant's uniform, her walk too purposeful, her route too direct. She passed by the teenager's table, and Mark saw the boy's entire body stiffen. Whatever she'd said or done had clearly frightened him. Mark needed more information. The decryption app was still running, analyzing secondary patterns in the bag's stitching. A new message appeared, this one encoded more deeply than the others. Asset 23. Carrier unaware. Time sensitive. His suspicions were confirmed. The boy was a carrier, someone chosen to unknowingly transport sensitive data. But carrier of what? And for whom? The flight attendant had disappeared down a service corridor, but her appearance had triggered a change in the watcher's behavior. Gray Suit folded his newspaper with deliberate precision, while Navy Blazer began a slow drift toward the cafe. They were preparing to move. Mark glanced at the departure board. Flight 2317 to Singapore was boarding at Gate 47, the gate number from the encoded message. A one-way trip to a country with no extradition treaty. If the boy boarded that flight. A commotion near the security checkpoint provided the answer Mark needed. A group of school athletes in matching jackets was passing through, their boisterous energy creating a momentary disruption. In that chaos, Mark spotted what the watchers were trying so hard to hide, the subtle outline of a shoulder holster under Gray Suit's jacket as he reached for his phone. These weren't intelligence officers on a sanctioned operation. This was something else entirely. The teenager suddenly stood up, grabbing his bag with shaking hands. His face had gone pale, and Mark could see beads of sweat on his forehead. Whatever the flight attendant had said to him had spurred him into action. Mark watched as the boy headed toward the bathrooms, his pace quickening with each step. Navy Blazer immediately began moving to intercept, while Gray Suit spoke quietly into what appeared to be a Bluetooth earpiece. They were done waiting. The extraction was beginning. Mark looked at his own phone one last time, at the final decoded message that had just appeared. It found, delivered to Ethan Carter. He must not board. Ethan Carter. Finally, a name. Mark pocketed his phone and stood up, adjusting his tie. The boy Ethan was about to be caught between two professional operators with unknown intentions. Whatever was hidden in that bag, whatever game was being played, an innocent teenager's life was now in danger. The airport terminal continued its normal rhythm around them, oblivious to the drama unfolding in its midst. Announcements echoed overhead, passengers rushed to their gates, and somewhere in the building, a jazz version of an old pop song played softly through the speakers. But beneath that ordinary veneer, a countdown had begun. Mark had minutes, maybe seconds, to decide his next move. The watchers were closing in, Ethan was walking into a trap, and somewhere in this sprawling terminal, more players were undoubtedly waiting to make their move. The game was no longer about intelligence or data or protocols. It was about saving a scared teenager who had no idea he'd been turned into a pawn in a very dangerous game. Mark kept his distance as he shadowed Ethan through the terminal, watching the boy's increasingly erratic movements. The teenager was practically radiating fear now, his earlier attempts at appearing casual completely abandoned. Every few steps, Ethan's head would whip around, checking behind him, above him, beside him, everywhere except where the real threats were waiting. The boarding gate for Flight 2317 loomed ahead, a one-way ticket to Singapore. Mark had seen enough trafficking operations to know what that meant. Singapore was a major intelligence hub, a place where sensitive data and the people carrying it had a habit of disappearing into the labyrinth of international espionage. Pulling out his phone, Mark activated an old intelligence tracking program, one that could access flight manifests through backdoor channels. His security clearance had expired years ago, but some passwords never got deactivated if you knew where to look. The passenger list for Flight 2317 appeared on his screen, and there it was. Carter Ethan M. Seat 23A, one-way ticket, no checked baggage. What caught Mark's attention wasn't just the one-way nature of the ticket, but the booking details. The reservation had been made just 6 hours ago, paid for in cryptocurrency, routed through 3 different travel agencies. Classic signs of an intelligence operation trying to cover its tracks. Ethan stopped at a water fountain, his shaking hands struggling to operate the button. The boy's fear was becoming more visible by the minute, threatening to draw exactly the kind of attention he needed to avoid. Mark watched as Ethan pulled out his own phone, staring at it with desperate intensity before shoving it back in his pocket. No calls, no texts. Whoever he wanted to reach out to, he thought better of it. Moving closer under the pretense of checking a departure board, Mark managed to catch a glimpse of Ethan's passport as the boy anxiously flipped it open again. It was new, too new. The pages were still stiff, the photo clearly recent. But it was the exit visa that set off alarm bells in Mark's head. The stamp used wasn't the standard tourist or business type. It was a diplomatic clearance, the kind that would let the bearer bypass normal customs procedures. Someone had gone to a lot of trouble to ensure Ethan Carter would have no trouble leaving the country. The overhead speakers crackled to life. Now boarding Flight 2317 to Singapore. All passengers please proceed to Gate 47. Ethan's reaction was immediate and visceral. His whole body tensed, and for a moment, Mark thought he might bolt. But then one of the watchers, the one in the navy blazer, appeared at his side as if materializing from thin air. "Time to board, Ethan," the man said quietly, placing a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. The gesture might have looked friendly to casual observers, but Mark recognized the tactical positioning, fingers pressed against specific pressure points, ready to inflict pain if necessary. I don't feel well," Ethan stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I should. Your father was very specific about you making this flight." Navy blazer cut in smoothly. "We wouldn't want to disappoint him, would we?" The mention of Ethan's father triggered something in the boy's expression, not recognition or relief, but a flash of confusion quickly masked by fear. It was brief, but Mark caught it. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Whoever these men were, they weren't connected to Ethan's family. The second watcher, gray suit, had positioned himself near the gate's security scanner, nodding to the attendant with the casual confidence of someone who'd already ensured his authority wouldn't be questioned. Around them, other passengers began lining up for boarding, completely unaware of the drama unfolding in their midst. Mark's mind raced through options. Direct intervention would be too risky. The watchers were clearly armed, and any confrontation would endanger civilians. He needed a way to prevent Ethan from boarding without triggering an incident. The line moved forward, and Navy blazer guided Ethan with it, maintaining that seemingly friendly but controlling grip. The boy's face had gone from pale to ashen, his eyes darting between the gate and the terminal exit, calculating distances he couldn't possibly cover. Mark had seen that look before, on assets about to be extracted against their will, on witnesses being quietly disappeared, on people who knew they were taking their last walk as free individuals. If Ethan boarded that plane, he would vanish into a world of interrogation rooms and classified facilities, another piece of collateral damage in the endless game of international intelligence. The boarding line shortened. 10 people ahead of Ethan. Then 7. Then 5. Mark's hand tightened around his phone. He had seconds to act, to prevent what was clearly about to become an international kidnapping. But these weren't random criminals. They were trained operators who had planned every detail, anticipated every normal intervention. 3 people ahead of Ethan now. Mark caught a glimpse of the bag's stitch symbols again, the hidden message that had started this all. "Help me. They are watching." Not, "They might be watching." Or, "I think they're watching." The message was certain, desperate, and now Mark understood why. 2 people ahead. Navy blazer's grip tightened on Ethan's shoulder as they approached the gate. The boy's steps became smaller, more hesitant, but the operative simply pushed him forward with practiced efficiency. Gray's suit maintained his position by the scanner, one hand casually resting inside his jacket. 1 person ahead. Mark knew what happened to people who disappeared onto flights like this. He'd been part of similar operations during his intelligence career, always telling himself the ends justified the means. But watching it happen to a terrified teenager, seeing the moment when hope drained from someone's eyes, it made all those old justifications turn to ash in his mouth. Ethan reached the gate, passport trembling in his hand. The attendant reached for it, and Mark saw the exact moment when the boy's last shred of resistance crumbled under the weight of his fear. It was time to move. Mark moved with the practiced ease of someone who'd spent years navigating hostile situations. Pulling his old business card from his wallet, the one that still carried enough weight to make people hesitate, he strode forward with purpose. "Ethan!" he called out cheerfully, as if spotting a familiar face. "I thought that was you. Your Uncle James mentioned you'd be traveling today." The effect was immediate. Navy Blazer's grip on Ethan's shoulder tightened fractionally, while Gray Suit's hand shifted inside his jacket. But they couldn't react more obviously, not with airport security cameras watching and civilians milling around. Ethan's eyes widened in confusion, but Mark caught the desperate glimmer of hope in them. The boy was smart enough to play along, even if he didn't understand what was happening. Yes," Ethan managed, his voice shaky but growing stronger as Mark approached. "I didn't expect to see anyone here." The boarding gate attendant paused in her scan of Ethan's passport, looking between them with mild interest. That pause was crucial. Any break in procedure was an opportunity. Navy Blazer stepped forward, his friendly smile not reaching his eyes. "I'm afraid we're on a tight schedule. Ethan's father is expecting him." Of course. Mark nodded, positioning himself carefully. He was now between Ethan and the gate, close enough to the security desk to make any aggressive move by the watchers too risky. "I just wanted to make sure he got the package his uncle sent." "You did get it right, Ethan?" The question hung in the air, loaded with meaning. Mark watched understanding dawn in Ethan's eyes. Someone knew something was wrong. Someone was trying to help. "The bag," Ethan whispered, clutching his backpack tighter. "It was in my locker this morning. I don't know who." "Step away from the boy." Gray Suit had abandoned his post by the scanner, approaching with measured steps. "This is a family matter." Mark turned, keeping his voice pitched to carry just far enough. "Funny, I know Ethan's entire family, and I've never seen either of you before." The boarding gate area had grown quieter, other passengers sensing the tension but not quite understanding it. A security guard near the metal detectors had noticed the confrontation, his hand moving to his radio. "Perhaps we should all calm down," Gray Suit said smoothly, reaching into his jacket. But instead of the weapon Mark had expected, he pulled out a badge. "Federal agent. This is a matter of national security." The badge looked real, the kind of real that only came from official channels. Mark had carried one similar to it during his active duty years. But something about the way Gray Suit held it, the angle he displayed it at, triggered another memory. Without warning, Mark stumbled forward, accidentally bumping into Ethan. In that brief contact, his trained fingers found the hidden seam in the bag's lining that no casual observer would have noticed. A small tear, precisely placed, leading to. There it was. His fingers brushed against something metallic and flat. A microchip, sewn into the fabric itself. Mark had handled enough classified tech to recognize the distinctive shape of a quantum encryption drive, the kind used for storing the most sensitive intelligence data. "I'm afraid I'll need to see some additional credentials," Mark said, straightening up. "Given the international nature of this flight, and the fact that you're attempting to transport a minor across borders." Navy Blazer's grip on Ethan's shoulder loosened slightly, the first sign of uncertainty. These men were professionals, but they hadn't expected resistance from someone who knew the playbook. "The boy is carrying stolen classified data," Gray Suit said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Step away. Now. This is your only warning." "I'm just a kid," Ethan burst out, his voice cracking. "I don't know anything about classified data. The bag just appeared in my locker. Please, I just want to go home." The fear in his voice was real, but there was something else too, anger. The anger of someone who'd been used, manipulated, turned into an unwitting pawn. Mark kept his expression neutral, but his mind was racing. The microchip in the bag, the mysterious appearance in the locker, the professional surveillance. This wasn't a simple intelligence operation. This was something bigger. "If this is an official operation," Mark said carefully, "then you won't mind if I call in to verify your credentials. I still have some friends in the agency who dash." He never finished the sentence. Gray's suit moved with startling speed, bringing his badge down in a sharp arc. But Mark had been waiting for it. He caught the man's wrist, using the momentum to spin him slightly. That's when he saw it, the microscopic holographic marker on the badge that identified it as counterfeit. A good fake, but fake nonetheless. "Run!" Mark shouted to Ethan, shoving the boy toward the nearby security checkpoint. "They're not agents!" The next few seconds exploded into chaos. Navy Blazer reached for his concealed weapon, but the nearby security guard had already drawn his. Gray's suit tried to regain his balance, his fake badge clattering to the floor. Passengers scattered, some screaming, others pulling out phones to record the confrontation. The boarding gate attendant hit the silent alarm, and in the distance, Mark could hear the heavy boots of airport security running toward them. But what happened next changed everything. A third figure emerged from the crowd, the flight attendant from earlier. She moved with the fluid grace of a trained operative, her hand extending toward Gray's suit. Instead of helping him up, she delivered a precise strike to his throat, dropping him instantly. Mark stared in shock as the woman's actions registered. She wasn't with them. She wasn't even a real flight attendant. This wasn't just a confrontation, it was an interception. The hidden truth was unraveling, and it was far more complex than anyone had realized. Alarms blared through the terminal as chaos erupted around the boarding gate. Gray's suit lay motionless on the ground, while Navy Blazer backed away, his hand still hovering near his concealed weapon. The false flight attendant positioned herself between Ethan and the operatives, her stance revealing years of combat training. "Step away from the boy," she commanded, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone used to giving orders. "He's carrying stolen classified data from the Cambridge breach." Mark's mind raced. The Cambridge breach, a massive cybersecurity incident that had never made the news. He'd heard whispers about it during his final months with the agency, but the details had been classified above his clearance level. "I don't have any data," Ethan protested, his voice rising with panic. "I'm just trying to get to my debate competition. I'm nobody." But Mark was starting to see the bigger picture. The bag, the symbols, the microchip. Ethan wasn't just carrying data. He was being used as a pawn in an elaborate game of misdirection. "You're right," Mark said slowly, keeping his eyes on the flight attendant. "You are nobody, Ethan. That's exactly why they chose you." The woman's expression flickered, surprise, then recognition. "Lawson," she said. "Mark Lawson. We were told you'd retired. Clearly, your intel needs updating," Mark replied, noting how she'd positioned herself to watch both approaches to the gate. "Just like your intel about the Cambridge breach." Navy Blazer made his move then, pulling his weapon. But the flight attendant was faster. In one fluid motion, she knocked the gun from his hand and drove her elbow into his solar plexus. The man crumpled, gasping for air. Airport security was closing in from both directions now, their shouts adding to the cacophony of alarms and panicked passengers. But Mark had caught something in the flight attendant's earlier words that didn't add up. "You said he's carrying stolen data," Mark said, keeping his voice steady. "But that's not true, is it? The data wasn't stolen. It was planted." The woman's eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I think I do," Mark continued, moving slightly to keep himself between her and Ethan. "The Cambridge breach was a cover story. The real operation was about getting specific data into the wrong hands, wasn't it?" Ethan clutched his bag tighter, looking between them with growing understanding. "The symbols," he said. "They weren't a cry for help, were they? They were instructions. A pickup protocol." Mark felt a surge of pride. The kid was sharp. "Exactly. Someone wanted that data to be found by specific people. And they needed a carrier who would look completely innocent. The flight attendant's composed demeanor cracked slightly. That data contains classified intelligence that could compromise national security. Stand down, Lawson. This is bigger than you understand. But Mark understood perfectly now. The elaborate surveillance, the fake agents, the international flight, it was all theater, designed to make everyone look in the wrong direction. The real threat isn't the data being stolen, he said, watching realization dawn on Ethan's face. It's about who finds it, and what they think they've discovered. A slow clap echoed through the terminal. A new figure emerged from behind the gate desk, a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit. Very good, Mr. Lawson, he said, his voice carrying a slight Eastern European accent. I was told you were one of the best analysts in the agency. Now I see why. The flight attendant stiffened, her hand moving to her side. Director Kovac. This isn't protocol. Protocol? The man, Kovac, laughed softly. My dear, protocol was never the objective. We needed someone to find this data. Someone specific. And thanks to young Mr. Carter here, they will. Mark's blood ran cold as the pieces fell into place. The symbols on the bag. They're not just instructions. They're a signature. You wanted them to think this came from a particular organization, yes, Kovac finished. One that our enemies have been watching very carefully. When they discover this data, they'll think they've uncovered a massive intelligence operation. They'll react accordingly. You're trying to start a war, Ethan whispered, horror creeping into his voice. Kovac smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. War is such an ugly word. Let's call it strategic realignment. The flight attendant moved with lightning speed, her hidden weapon appearing in her hand. But Kovac merely raised an eyebrow. I wouldn't. Look around you. Mark did. Throughout the terminal, he could now spot them, at least a dozen individuals who had seemingly appeared from nowhere, all watching the scene unfold. Not airport security. Not regular passengers. Professional operators, positioned to control every exit. You see, Kovac continued, young Ethan here was never meant to board the flight. He was meant to be intercepted. And now, thanks to this little scene, there will be dozens of witnesses who saw federal agents trying to stop him from leaving the country with classified data. The perfect cover story, Mark realized. By tomorrow, intelligence agencies worldwide would be scrambling to figure out what data the boy had been carrying. They'd find exactly what Kovac wanted them to find. You use me, Ethan said, his voice shaking not with fear now, but with anger. You put my life at risk just to make a story look real. Kovac shrugged. Individual lives rarely matter in the grand scheme of things. But if it makes you feel better, you've played your part admirably. The alarms continued to blare, and genuine airport security was getting closer. Mark could hear radio chatter, the sound of boots on tile. But he knew they were just adding to the performance Kovac had orchestrated. The real threat wasn't the fake agents who had tried to stop Ethan. It wasn't even the data hidden in his bag. The real threat was what that data would make people believe, and what they would do once they believed it. Mark looked at Ethan, then at the approaching security teams, and made his decision. If Kovac wanted to create chaos, then maybe chaos was exactly what they needed, just not the kind he was expecting. Mark's hand slipped into his pocket, fingers brushing against his phone. Years of intelligence work had taught him one crucial lesson. Sometimes the best way to stop a conspiracy wasn't to expose it, but to make it impossible to complete. Terminal security override, he whispered into the device, using a command phrase he'd hoped never to need again. Authorization, Lawson Mark J, code black. The terminal's lights flickered, then died, plunging the entire wing into darkness. Emergency lights kicked in, casting everything in an eerie red glow. But more importantly, every security camera in the vicinity went dark. No witnesses. No recordings. No proof of what was about to happen. Clear the area! Mark shouted, his voice carrying the authority that made civilians instinctively obey. Security threat! Everyone out! The crowd scattered, leaving only the key players in their deadly tableau. Kovac's smile had vanished, replaced by something harder, more dangerous. Impressive, the director said. But futile. The data is already in play. Is it? Mark grabbed Ethan's bag, his fingers finding the hidden seam. With one sharp movement, he ripped it open, extracting the microchip. You mean this data? The one that's supposed to trigger your strategic realignment? But Kovac's expression didn't change. If anything, his smile widened. Did you really think we'd put the actual data in the hands of a teenager? That chip is a decoy, Mr. Lawson. The real data was transmitted hours ago, when young Ethan's phone connected to the airport Wi-Fi. Mark's blood ran cold. He turned to Ethan, who was already pulling out his phone, face pale. They made me download an app this morning. Said it was for tracking my flight. And now that transmission has been logged, documented, and tracked by every intelligence agency monitoring this airport's communications. Kovac continued. By tomorrow morning, they'll all have proof that a massive data breach occurred here. The only question is, what will they find when they decrypt it? Mark's mind raced. There had to be a way to stop this, to prevent whatever false flag operation Kovac had set in motion. That's when his phone buzzed, a message from a number he hadn't seen in years. Sarah Chin. He read aloud, watching Kovac's smile falter for the first time. Remember her? My old partner from the cyber division? What about her? Kovac's voice had lost its smooth confidence. Funny thing about Sarah, she never really retired. She's been running a deep cover operation, tracking a certain group of rogue intelligence officers. Officers who've been trying to manipulate global politics through engineered conflicts. Mark typed a quick sequence into his phone, and suddenly every emergency screen in the terminal lit up with scrolling data. While we've been having this lovely chat, Sarah's team has been backtracing your transmission. They've identified not just the receiving servers, but every failsafe and relay point you set up. Kovac's operators began moving in, but Mark held up his hand. I wouldn't. Right now, Sarah has control of your entire network. One wrong move, and every intelligence agency in the world gets proof of what you're really trying to do here. You're bluffing, Kovac snarled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. Am I? Mark nodded toward the screens, where specific names and locations were now appearing. Those look like your safe houses, Director. Your funding sources. Your actual mission parameters. The false flight attendant moved first, her weapon dropping to the floor. She'd seen enough to know which way the wind was blowing. Around the terminal, other operators began backing away, melting into the shadows. It's over, Director, Mark said quietly. Your own people can see it. Whatever you were trying to start here, it's finished. Kovac's face contorted with rage. His hand moved toward his jacket, but before he could reach whatever weapon he had concealed there, the sound of multiple safeties clicking off echoed through the terminal. Federal agents! Hands where we can see them! Real federal agents swarmed in from every entrance, their tactical gear and weapons leaving no doubt about their authenticity. Sarah's team had been busy indeed. As Kovac was secured and his operators rounded up, Mark turned to Ethan, who looked shell-shocked but remarkably composed. You okay, kid? Ethan managed a shaky smile. I think I'm going to miss my debate competition. I'd say you've had enough arguing for one day, Mark replied, drawing a surprised laugh from the boy. So what happens now? Ethan asked, watching as Kovac was led away in handcuffs. Now? Mark sighed, already dreading the debriefing sessions to come. Now we figure out exactly who put that bag in your locker, and why they chose you specifically. Something tells me this goes deeper than even Kovac knows. Sarah Chin herself appeared, looking exactly as Mark remembered her. Practical suit, no-nonsense expression, and the sharpest eyes in intelligence work. Good to see you haven't lost your touch, Mark, she said, then turned to Ethan. And you, young man, handled yourself remarkably well for someone who never asked to be part of this world. Speaking of which, Mark added, we need to get you home. Your parents must be worried sick. But Sarah's expression stopped him. That's complicated, she said carefully. The person who planted the bag in Ethan's locker? We've identified them. And let's just say there's a reason Ethan was chosen. Mark looked at the boy with new understanding. Who are you really, Ethan? I don't know, Ethan admitted, and for the first time, Mark heard steel beneath the fear in his voice. But I'd like to find out. Sarah nodded approvingly. And we're going to help you do exactly that. After all, someone went to a lot of trouble to put you in the middle of this operation. The question is, who are they playing against? As emergency crews began restoring power to the terminal and passengers slowly filtered back in, Mark knew this was just the beginning. Kovac's conspiracy had been stopped, but the real game, the one that had placed an innocent teenager at the center of an international intelligence war, was still unfolding. Somewhere out there, hidden players were moving pieces on a board he couldn't yet see. But for now, they had won this round, saved an innocent life, and prevented what could have been a catastrophic international incident. Not bad for what had started as a normal day at the airport. Come on, Mark said to Ethan, guiding him toward the exit. Let's get you out of here. Something tells me your real journey is just beginning.